Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to join the conversation, and thank you for the brief introduction. And grateful to be participating with you from here in Anchorage, Alaska, where I assume it's just a bit brisker than you have down there in Houston right now. Right now we're at 9 degrees Fahrenheit outside the door, and so I assume that's probably about a 70 point or so spread from where you're at. Uh, the Arctic Mineral Awareness Center, of course, is one of the centers of excellence that are part of the Department of Homeland Security's uh, centers of excellence within the Science and Technology Directorate, along with, of course, our colleagues there at the University of Houston. We are a center of excellence that's focused on maritime research, and one of two centers that are so oriented for us. This is principally focused on the United States Coast Guard. Our hub is here at the University of Alaska Anchorage, but we really are a research network that spans the nation and has an awful lot of collaboration with our colleagues in Canada. We are obviously trying to advance Arctic science that to benefit the U.S. Coast Guard from operationally relevant research vantage point in areas such as geophysical environment modeling, quite a bit of work in marine robotics, spend quite a bit of time in command center type activities and decision support science. But we also support the Maritime Environmental Response Committee with biological and marine environmental focus sciences. We provide satellite relay links for small satellites in support of the Coast Guard and DHS's communications efforts in the Arctic. Quite a bit of research that's focused on infrastructure and civil engineering, some work in big data analytics, and then also a fair amount of work in the social sciences, specifically oriented to the Alaska Native community in Western and North Slope, Alaska. So in that regards, our center, of course, is one driven on operator, I call it operator-driven research that's focused on the Coast Guard, but also our operators. We do partner quite extensively with the federal maritime security and safety communities, but we're like all the other centers in DHS, we're here to support the public good. Accordingly, the customers, if you will, are those, of course, the Coast Guard, obviously the maritime shipping world, which we're going to talk about more extensively, but also local folks in Western and North Slope, Alaska, including folks that are indigenous hunters. And the risk those folks take on when they go out and pursue bowhead whale is insane from my vantage point. So if there's anything that our research can do to support their risk management strategies, there's goodness with that. But among the centers, we're probably a bit unique in the aspect that all DHS centers are focused on science, technology, research and development, and of course education programs. But those yellow boxes are essentially flyers from different workshops that we host, and we host an extensive amount of workshops that are focused on problem sets that are driven by Arctic operators' concerns, to include specifically looking at those things that U.S. Coast Guard operational tactical commanders are concerned about, specifically those that are driven by the concerns of U.S. Coast Guard District 17, essentially Coast Guard Alaska's commander down in Juneau, an active serving two-star. And some of the challenges that maritime operator community faces are really oriented to the Arctic of weather, distances, sea ice conditions, logistics, of course, because you're a long way from help in North Slope and Western Alaska. Communications is a serious challenge in most of the Arctic, particularly in Arctic Alaska. And then essentially trying to help the operator be better in their decision science, in finding where people are at or in need, finding a way to get at people, and they're conducting illicit and illegal activities, responding in disasters, including how to characterize those aspects that are affecting it in a disaster humanitarian assistance response, and then of course identifying those things that are threats to essentially our U.S. national defense and security concerns, again oriented to the Coast Guard statutory missions. So our efforts as a center is really focused on science technology, but also knowledge products. Sometimes not just a better widget, but sometimes it's knowledge products that affect not only the Coast Guard, but the community of federal on-scene coordinators that are responding to crises under Coast Guard leadership in the U.S. Arctic Maritime region. And then obviously trying to convene folks to think through the challenges and provide solutions, whether it's new research, whether it's knowledge products, but essentially trying to pull apart problems with workshops that are driven by expert analysis. And then of course, like all centers, try to educate the next generation of STEM professionals that are focused on the Homeland Security enterprise and specifically oriented towards the Arctic region. Accordingly, though, all that should be driven to the fact that we are in the business of prosecuting research. And for us, doing this research in a way that's helpful for the Coast Guard and making it operationally relevant. We appreciate all the great work folks like the National Science Foundation do, et cetera. Our research is really driven to reduce risk, improve decision support, characterize the changing Arctic environment. We do extensive amount of work, not only across the US, but also extensively with Canada, and some also, of course, international, our colleagues in Iceland, Denmark, Danish, Greenland, Norway, Sweden, Finland. So it's really focused on the Arctic and Nordic region. And then for us, we do extensively collaborate with the Alaska Native community as well as the Arctic Indigenous community of North America. The way this gets down to us, again, or not to read this, but just these are the kind of science technology products that we're part of. And this hits kind of every major area of activity we have either done or underway doing, again, focused on the Arctic mission set. Our website has these projects listed out for those who are interested. So viewing, and I give that to you simply just as background. And of course, these slides will be available too as well. We communicate with a wide community, and that's those folks that are on this slide here are part of our research collaboration network, either directly funded or direct collaboration for us. So I give that as a background, and simply in the matter of time here, focusing on what this presentation is about. It was really in concert, the port of the future. One of the things that we want to talk about, of course, as it relates to the port of the future in an Arctic or Alaskan context, is really a mission of, so why would you need a port of the future in Arctic Alaska as a constellation of ports of the future? And we focused our energies towards an academic analytics of a feasibility of liquefied natural gas, which is a pretty massive commodity in North Slope, Alaska, and it's been not yet tapped. We've extracted billions of or millions of barrels of oil. I should say not billions, but millions of barrels of oil. But we certainly have not yet cracked the code of really cracking of getting the extensive amount of natural gas to market. So we focused this in taking a look at the suitability and then make this a presentation for you today of moving liquefied natural gas from North Slope, Alaska, which is extensive, to essentially through the economic zones of the Bering, of the Beaufort, Chukchi, and Bering Seas to market. This is something that once upon a time it wasn't even considered feasible. And here's an example of why in the past this wasn't feasible, and how, depending on what could happen in the Arctic region, the feasibility is really driven by the fact that over the course of time, sea ice has been a tremendous barrier and of moving any sort of shipping through ice. The reason the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was established was because moving of oil by sea and tankers was considered just absolutely economically infeasible, and simply not feasible also because the physical barrier that sea ice presented itself. Those decisions then rendered a pipeline in the 1970s are no longer relevant today. But there is still quite a bit of variance in sea ice in the region. And I will share with you, moving liquefied natural gas to market is all about either one of two ways. You either move it through building a second pipeline to follow the existing Trans-Alaska oil pipeline, or you find a way to liquefy it and move it via vessel. As just an example of the variance of sea ice conditions in the Arctic, the two pictures you see on the screen there, one was actually taken 1 year earlier in June 2018, and 1 year and 2 days later, that same spot is now, where you couldn't get out on the ice, is in the lower picture. So there is variances in localized sea ice conditions along the Alaskan Chukchi and Beaufort Sea coast. This is just southwest of Point Barrow. And the reality is for us that no matter what decisions are made, that you need to deal with the fact that sea ice is a relatively unpredictable force of nature, but it is something easier to predict based on improved science. So the background, of course, Prudhoe Bay was oil discovered in the 60s. It's been known there for generations. Literally, it comes out of the ground in many places in Arctic Alaska. But moving via sea was considered just absolutely incapable in the 1970s. Then, of course, that's what resulted in the establishment of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. The motivation for us to do this study, of course, is driven by two factors. One, we do research characterizing the Arctic environment for the U.S. Coast Guard, and this includes characterizing sea ice conditions. And the top screen is actually a completed research project for our center. This is operationalized through NOAA's Alaskan Ocean Observation System, and that characterizes sea ice conditions of a sea ice presence, thickness, movement, and ridging down essentially to 2 kilometers resolution, Pan-Arctic. And then we're also in the business of developing an ice condition index for Arctic mariners. And so for us, our motivation is like, hey, look, if we're doing these things, let's take a look at the why. Why would people be wanting to leverage these tools? And then to us, this drove us to the point where we see the Arctic region is coming more economically and commercially viable for maritime shipping. Commodities to market that are happening in Yamal, Russia, give essentially the impetus why the same thing couldn't be done, and perhaps done for a lower cost coming off North Slope, Alaska, and I'll talk about more in a minute. So the problem statement for us was, is it economically feasible or is it physically feasible to move LNG from North Slope, Alaska to market? The basis of the problem statement, of course, is a warming Arctic is resulting in less sea ice. And then, of course, increasing fidelity of decision support tools and characterizing the physical environment, also critically important. And then realistic look down for cost. So there's cost somewhere between $5 to $10 billion to establish LNG shipping off of North Slope, Alaska, depending whose estimate you talk to. We're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 billion to move, essentially create a new pipeline and move it south along the existing Trans-Alaska pipeline, but an LNG pipe. And so it's a fraction of the cost to ship. The picture you see there is actually an LNG tanker at Yamal, Russia. We'll talk about this in just a moment. And this is actually, Yamal, Russia is a place that was jointly funded by essentially European interests, Russian interests, and Chinese. And this is essentially on the Arctic side of Russia, obviously east of Zoya, and that's actually the large extent of land sticking up into the Arctic basin. But this peninsula, colored in red, is actually an area where there is extensive amount of natural gas. It's been liquefied now, and it's moving to market, to both European markets as well as to East Asian markets. And what's enabled this is actually using specialized LNG tankers that they're currently 15. Their plans to make up another 42 more. There is a lot of gas to be moved from market. The question is right now is that could we do the same thing in the United States? And based on distances to Asian markets, the distances in ice-laden waters is considerably less than of course what the folks face in off the North Slope of Russia. When we look at looking at our extent of ice, the first thing we would take a look at there is a minimum sea ice extent compared to Russia and the United States EEZs. Both the United States and Russia share a vantage point where the sea ice is diminishing quite extensively along our respective coastlines, and that's of course quite considerably different than what Canada and Greenland are facing on their side. There is, of course, over the last 40 years, a continual decline of sea ice to the point where it is now about 40% less in current conditions than in 1979. This year has been an extensive, this winter, I should say, has been an extensive winter for sea ice comparatively to previous years. but again, it's much thinner. And even though we're back to historical norms this winter based on a cold Arctic season, much colder than anyone perhaps had forecast, but that's driven something along the lines of an Arctic oscillations will periodically create colder than expected winters, while even though the trend is working towards warmer winters. The bottom line for us, so even all that being said, the Arctic region continues off our slope, North Slope and Western Alaska, to be much less sea ice conditions than other locations. This is a photo of former Lieutenant Governor Meade Treadwell, who's leading an LNG project, a commercial activity, and our study was underway as this thing came out on the in the open here a couple months ago. We've been kind of cranking along on this feasibility study for just about a year as a student-led activity. But as a result, we're seeing now that the commercial sector is trying to create this business profile where you can actually create LNG shipping and take it to market. The same thoughts that they have is what our students came up with. In fact, there's a shorter transit in ice-laden waters to East Asian markets from Alaska compared to Yamal, Russia, and therefore making it perhaps more economically viable. And especially when you think about the warmer summer seasons, making the fact of the number of ice-hardened vessels to be considerably less. And in the summertime, you're realistically looking at virtually open waters for several months. The current infrastructure, of course, in the Arctic for Alaska is very limited. There's limited physical infrastructure as far as ports of refuge, ports of commercial ports, and then even so is relatively shallow draft. We don't have currently a deep water port. We do have Nome, Alaska, a port with a draft of 22 feet. Anyone who's involved in much commercial shipping realizes that's pretty darn shallow. Anything less than 30 feet draft is just about nil as far as most commercial vessels. But the story short, these limitations are relatively mitigatable, and certainly you can manage through if at the end of the day, the principal port facilities there in the Prudhoe area, where there's quite a bit of buildup, could be leveraged for essentially an LNG offload. And then the only thing you really need along the route would be ports of refuge or an emergency port for a commercial vantage point somewhere along the way, just in case problems come up. The closest deep draft port, though, and again, this whole region of essentially from Prudhoe all the way into the southern Bering is relatively shallow water. And so deep draft ports are something you're not going to find nearby shore. You can put things out in the water, but nonetheless, that's a challenge to say the very least. Some of the other challenge, of course, is minimal search and rescue. We have challenges with lack of bathymetric charting, which is not just a unique Alaska problem, it's unique for the Arctic region. Challenge because of a diminishing ice environment, weather forecasting is less comprehensive than it used to be because the variables are changing quite so dynamically. Communications remains, as I mentioned earlier, a serious challenge for the region. We've actually done quite a bit of work there characterizing sea ice conditions as one example, one way to mitigate risk. Again, all the way down to 2-kilometer resolution. We're publishing that on a 7-day, bi-weekly and 7-day hindcast, 30-day forecast. And this is all the way through essentially the Bering Straits further north, again, across the Pan-Arctic region. This is called a project called High Resolution Ice Ocean Modeling and Assimilation. And this is essentially using satellite-derived data and a whole lot of quadratic equations to actually model, where you can actually model up to the point of actually seeing forecast model of sea ice leads in a Pan-Arctic view. Quite remarkable. And so this for us is something we've operationally transitioned, and it supports a lot of thinking and essentially strategic planning. To include, of course, taking a look at a 1-kilometer edition where we've actually compared it to actual sea ice conditions off of Point Barrow, just as a compare and contrast. And then for us, it's an opportunity to take a look at month to month, year to year. What are the seasons where people can plan to actually negotiate sea ice in essentially the Beaufort and Chukchi seas in a way that's relatively manageable. Story short for us, though, is that when we look at circumpolar ice breaking, we're limited on our side for escort. And then, of course, Russia is crushing the ball when it comes to the amount of ice escort they can do So ice hardened vessels perhaps are one of the better things you can do, so they can essentially do ice self-escort in ice-laden waters for the bulk of the year. And then, of course, there is ecological concerns that there is a fishing industry aspect. The fish stocks are moving further north into from the Bering into the Chukchi simply because of the warming condition, and that is the second largest fishery in the world is in the Bering Sea region. Marine mammals, of course, are a big deal for not only for Marine Protection Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, but also to indigenous hunters. And of course, the pollution risk and any sort of increased maritime operations in the pristine region has an impact. Sociological, economical, of course, it makes sense for our vantage point from the state of Alaska to actually have LNG shipping of a commodity that's sitting in the ground right now, and it could be relatively moved to market at relatively low cost compared to via shipping versus pipelines. And of course, an area that needs more economic stability. It's our economic interest, if you will, in North Slope and Western Alaska to find a way to conduct more shipping, because an area that's economically depressed and an area that's having a hard time maintaining a robust population. And it's an area for us that, as an Alaskan, that if you don't have people who are Arctic Sentinels living there and can't afford to live there, then it makes a challenge for, can we continue to maintain sovereign claims over the ground? Beyond the scope of this conversation, but when we look at technology aspects, they're essentially being able to characterize the Arctic region in a meaningful way and what's happening, and then making sure that decision makers who are actually driving the vessels know what route to take, what's the risk associated with it, and that's what we're talking about in this particular slide here. We have an ice condition index for the Arctic region, essentially a mariner decision support tool, knowing which way to go and what the risk factors are, and it's tailored to essentially 10 categories of different vessels. Our conclusion, of course, is that this is something that if they can do it successfully in Russia, we should be able to do it successfully in the United States. We actually have a less to go in ice-laden waters compared to our colleagues in Russia, and it certainly makes sense for tapping an under-leveraged resource. It is not without risk, but the risks are mitigatable. And of course, one thing that really helps is the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code. And at the end of the day, it's just probably a whole lot cheaper to do a LNG shipping compared to establishing another pipeline at a fraction of the cost and tap a lot of material. So that's what I wanted to cover with. I was told to name this tune in 30 minutes. Our bottom line as a center is we continue to do things like this to try to advance operator-driven science technology in a way that's useful with Coast Guard as well as other Arctic operators. I thank you for the gift of your time. I'm happy to take any questions before I'm given the hook.